Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Let's see. Great. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. Really excited to see you tonight. Thanks for spending your evening with us. So my name is Billy. I am one of the directors of the public trainings team at Rising Organizers. And welcome to a Rising Organizers and Sunrise Movement training. So this is a 3-part series entitled Making Your Issues Electoral. This is the second part. We had the first part last week, which I know some of you attended. And this training will focus on nonviolent direct actions. So if you weren't able to make the first training, don't worry about it. We can absolutely send you the recordings. You can get a little caught up, and we'll do a little bit of review at the beginning as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the trainers to let them introduce themselves. And then we'll get started. I want to send a really quick reminder to everyone's reminder, if you were there for the last training, that we have Nancy doing slides, one of the other co-directors from Rising Organizers. We also have Katie on the chat and on Troll Watch, so please be nice. And yeah, like I said, I'm going to hand it over to Anna and Sophia, who are going to introduce themselves.
Cool. Thanks, Billy. Hey, my name is Anna. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm from Southern California originally, and I'm affiliated with Rising Organizers as well as the Sunrise Movement. I was a spring fellow this past year with Rising Organizers, and I've been involved with Sunrise, their DC hub, for about a year now. And I'll pass it along to Sophia.
Hey everyone, I'm Sophia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Northern Virginia, but I've been in DC about 7 years. I organize with Occupation Free DC, and I also am an alum of the Rising Organizers Fellowship Program. So really happy to be with you all today.
Cool. So before we get started today, we're going to do a quick run through of who our organizations are. So Rising Organizers was founded in 2016 to provide free trainings to new and emerging activists and leaders who wanted to take action for the first time following the awful presidential election results. So RO puts on trainings and a fellowship program several times a year, which are all free, precisely because there can be significant barriers to joining progressive activism. And trainings can be really expensive, and some folks might feel like they need to be qualified to join with degrees or certifications, but you really don't. All you need is passion and a willingness to learn. And the other group here today is the Sunrise Movement, which as a whole was founded in 2017 to put pressure on elected officials to end the climate crisis and create millions of good-paying jobs in the process through Green New Deal legislation. So the Sunrise DC Hub in particular partakes in recruitment, trainings, direct actions, partnerships work, and much, much more to both advance this goal and to fight for local racial and economic justice issues here in DC. So yeah, we're all super excited to be here with you guys. So on the next slide. So why are Sunrise and RO partnering to put out these training sessions? So we at RO and Sunrise think there's potentially a problem where community organizers are really good at getting people in the streets, but they rarely get new leaders elected into office. And at the same time, political organizers are great at getting people elected, but they rarely get people out in the streets taking mass action. So the solution that we think is to fuse both of these, because that's how you build the immense pressure that's needed to make politicians take any sort of meaningful action. So basically you present them with a crowd of people that can't be ignored and demand the politician to take action, or else we will vote them out. So, and of course, these descriptions are super big generalizations, and there's definitely exceptions to what I just said, but that's kind of the idea. So I'll pass it along to Sophia.
Thanks, Anna. So as we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. One, we just ask folks to hop on mute for now as we're presenting, and if you feel comfortable, turn on your video so we can see your faces. And if you want to see more than just the speaker when the presentation is being shared, you could go up to your settings and choose side-by-side mode, and you'll be able to see more people. You can also turn on your gallery view when we're in breakout rooms so you can see everyone. And then we also just ask you to drop your name, pronouns, and where you're calling from into the chat so that we can all start to get to know each other and get comfortable sharing our thoughts. We have built in a lot of opportunities to participate and be interactive with one another, so please feel free to share. So there are also a couple of important acknowledgements that we want to share today. And as I share each one, we're going to take a little pause afterwards. So the first thing is that we want to give a land acknowledgement, which basically just is a recognition that the US was established on Native land. And we, as your facilitators, are based in Washington, D.C., which is Piscataway land, and they're the indigenous people who are still here today. And we want to acknowledge the continued resilience of Native people in their continuing struggle for liberation. Second, we want to acknowledge and mourn the loss of George Floyd and so many other Black lives stolen by white supremacist actions in these last couple months alone. Our hearts and support and rage go out to Black people everywhere. We stand in solidarity with all Black folks demanding justice and demanding that their voices be heard. Thank you. So we also want to share some norms to get started. So as you can see on the slide, we listed some that we have come up with. The first is that we don't have all the answers, obviously, but we do have tools to teach you that will help you find your own answers. And I'm sure that many of you have lots of wisdom to share. The second is to just be nice. You know, we're all dealing with a lot right now. Be nice to yourself, be nice to one another, respect, us. We ask that. We are totally volunteering, dedicating our time to this because we believe in the work. Just know that we have a staff member here who is entirely dedicated to kicking out trolls. So if you encounter a troll, just drop it in the chat and we'll take care of it for you. Another norm that you can see here is that what's said here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. So people may be sharing vulnerable stories in the chat or in the breakouts, and we just ask people to be mindful and keep those details here, but any lessons you learn you can take with you. And finally, we encourage you to participate. As I said earlier, we have a lot of interactive activities, so the success of this training will rely on how much you can participate with us. So that's what we want to offer. Do folks have any other norms that you would like to see? And if so, you can put it in the chat and we'll give you like 15 seconds to add anything else that you think would be helpful for the space. So I see Katie has said, let it get weird. Regina said, move up, move back. Do either of you want to expand upon those? You can feel free to unmute yourself or put it more in the chat.
Sure. I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Move up, move back. Also, people may have heard step up, step back. If you're a person who tends to dominate the conversation, step back and move back and think, why am I talking? Am I talking to this space? Also, give others a chance to share because everyone's thoughts and experiences are valuable.
Thank you, Regina. I would love to piggyback off of that. I'll be watching the chat, and in that things might get weird or you might need a little space. If you need us to peel you off into a breakout room or something to just have a little space in case you're feeling deep feelings or feeling deep anger and you can't focus, let us know. We'll be happy to give you a little space. As well as, I think that plays into the let it get weird. A lot of terrible things are happening, and that's why we're here. and we want you to be emotionally ready to be here. So if it has to be an awkward moment, we embrace that so that we can clear our thoughts and then communicate more clearly.
Thank you both so much. I think those are really important, and I hold those as well. So as we get started, I want to just briefly run through our agenda. So first, we will define strategy. We'll define what actions and targets are, and we will use a case study to show what makes an action effective. And then we will discuss the importance of using actions to bring the public closer to our side. Ultimately, when you leave this session, we hope that you will have learned how to plan strategic, effective actions. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Anna.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, so what even is organizing? I'm just going to start with some definitions. It might be a little review of the last training, but yeah, so we define organizing as building and shaping power to change politics, with power being defined as the ability to act and achieve a purpose. So power in this sense can come in two forms: organized people or organized money. And then strategy, which that term will be discussed in further detail by Sophia, is basically the road we take from powerlessness to having power. And so just to kind of paint a picture of what we mean by these two different types of power, what people power looks like is what we're doing here today. We're organized people in the sense that we're here, we're having trainings like hosted by organized groups with shared values. And then people power can also look like the NRA, or the National Rifle Association, which boasts millions of individual members. And so that's people power in terms of numbers. And then an example of organized money or money power can look like the fossil fuel lobby. The fossil fuel companies like Chevron or ExxonMobil aren't just randomly throwing their money around. Year after year, they engage in strategic spending campaigns where they put millions of dollars toward getting politicians elected and to lobby already elected officials on policies that basically are in their favor. So even though these companies don't have the same numbers of supporters that lots of grassroots organizations do, they still are able to wield their money as political power through things like lobbying and campaign donations. So in our last training in this series, the trainers discussed a lot how often in our movements there's a disconnect between people power and political power. And so what we seek to teach movement organizers is how to build political power, and to teach electoral organizers how to build people power. And this is super important because Republicans are already super good at this, and Republicans are part of what we're up against in this fight. So this training series today is really about the relationship between people power and political power. And so we're going to start off by dividing folks into some breakout rooms of small groups to talk about an action that you've attended. And that could be like a protest, a sit-in, a vigil, something like that. And if you've never attended any sort of direct action, you can maybe talk about an action that you've heard or read about or something like that. And when you're all sharing, maybe try to think about what the intended goal of the action was and what strategies were used to achieve that goal. And did you find the action to be strategic, and in what way? What seemed to work and what didn't? So we'll give you guys about 5 minutes to chat in your group, and then afterwards, for those who would like to, we'll have time to share and discuss what you guys all talked about. And as a quick reminder before we get broken up, if there are any trolls in your group, definitely feel free to leave your group. Take care of yourselves, and you're always welcome to post in the chat as well if you're having any issues. Awesome. Welcome back, everybody, as well. Yeah, so for those who would like to, can you please maybe share like some examples that you discussed in your small groups? You could either just like toss something in the chat, or you're all welcome to take yourselves off of mute and share. Yeah, take your time.
Well, I'm kind of new to all this. Hi, I'm Bryce. I use pronouns she, her. I guess my experience with like a protest, or the first time that I went to a protest, at least in North Carolina, I kind of was able to find what I thought was not a great way to organize, or like I didn't really appreciate the strategies, just because I feel like it was surrounding George Floyd and Breonna Taylor wasn't mentioned at all. And just for me personally, I find that Black women are often not given the same attention that I feel like they deserve. And going there kind of was a learning experience for me, because I learned what to look out for as far as the way people speak, the kind of who they allow to speak, because there was a white girl who got on that like talked about her missionary trip to Africa. So that was like very in poor taste, and it just really did not sit well with me that they were willing to give that person so much room to speak when it wasn't very clear, one, what her point was. And she like kind of went into this kind of off topic where she was like asking for forgiveness, and it was very tone deaf and like very uncomfortable. But yeah, like I said, I feel like it was a learning experience, because I like know what to look out for now. I know like as far as what I would like to see from a movement that I am a part of, or like from organizers that like I want to learn from, kind of what kind of stuff I'd like to hear versus, other stuff. So
Thank you so much, Bryce, for sharing. Did anybody else feel comfortable coming off of mute to share? So John in the comments said they talked about the protests in Rochester, New York, and some of their experiences in organizing, and how Katie mentioned how important it is not just to organize an action, but to also do coalition building and to coordinate with community after the action happens. Definitely. Cool. So feel free to keep adding things to the chat if you would like, but we can move on. So one of the most critical parts of any action is knowing what you want to get out of the action. We call this having a want, and it's super important that we're as specific as possible with our want. If you've heard of Sunrise in the past, you might know that something that we want are good, clean jobs and a livable future. But when you frame the want in that way, it can feel like a huge, not super clearly defined goal, and it might not be clear when this goal has been met. So Sunrise at the same time tries to take a more focused and actionable approach to achieve this huge goal by fighting more specifically for strong commitments to the Green New Deal as well as corresponding legislation. So therefore, the Green New Deal is our specific want. Also, just to back up, Regina also added to the comments that they talked about a protest at Mitch McConnell's house, but he wasn't home, whoops. And they talked about a pro-choice clinic escorting and watching what can be perceived as assault, merely facing the anti-choice people can sometimes cause them to accuse you. And that it's important to watch what you say and know others are listening and try to figure out information about you. Cool. Thanks, Regina. Okay, I'll pass it along to Sophia.
Great. So those are all really great examples of actions that worked or didn't work. And so now we want to talk about how do we get to what we want to achieve? How do we get to the goals and get what we want? And the answer is strategy. No campaign can achieve its goals without a strategy in place. So we define strategy as turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. So turning what you have, like in the present moment, into what you need to get what you want. So in order to implement a strategy and turn something that we have into what we need, we have to do something. And that something is an action. Actions are what allow us to convert something we need into something we have. So in most campaigns, there are a lot of things that we need, right? Which is why it's important to plan tons of well-timed actions to convert things we need into things we have. So for example, the sunrise sit-ins in Nancy Pelosi's office in 2018, which were amazing, were a prime example of an action. So we'll come back to that example. But before that, let's define what an action is. So in organizing, we define an action as something that creates a reaction. This is a broad definition. So basically, if something large or small changes in the world because of something that you do, that thing was an action. An effective action is one that gets a reaction that advances your strategy. So we will talk more about what a reaction looks like in a couple of slides, but essentially any successful campaign uses a variety of actions that ultimately move a target that has power. So to kind of put all those terms into more concrete like reality, we're gonna watch a quick video from 2018 when Sunrise mobilized young people from across the country to occupy Nancy Pelosi's office. Just pay attention to the strategies that were used in this action, including how members of Sunrise interacted with the media. So let's watch it.
Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on?
1,000 young climate activists with the Sunrise Movement descended on Capitol Hill on Monday to demand a Green New Deal, a plan for the U.S. to become carbon neutral within a decade and create tens of millions of jobs in the renewable energy sector.
Things that would fall under it are moving our society to 100% renewables, creating good, livable wage jobs for anyone who wants one to stop the climate crisis, alleviating and beginning to eliminate poverty, especially for those who are most impacted, who are in the nexus of pollution and poverty every single day. It would look like transforming our public transportation, our entire energy system, and ultimately eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from every sector.
For the second time since Democrats won control of the House in the midterms, the Sunrise Movement held a sit-in in top-ranking Democrat Nancy Pelosi's office. They demanded the creation of a Green New Deal-focused select committee that can draft legislation, as proposed by Representative-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Pelosi is the likely next House Speaker.
We are 3 times the size that we were just 3 weeks ago when we were here before.
In response to last month's protests, Pelosi said she would reinstate 2007's Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. But Sunrise says that's not enough.
The previous committee would talk about climate change, would talk about the science, but wouldn't actually have legislative powers.
The activists also targeted incoming House Majority Leader Representative Steny Hoyer of Maryland and incoming Rules Committee Chair Representative Jim McGovern. 143 were arrested in the sit-ins. McGovern endorsed the Select Committee for a Green New Deal, becoming the 23rd representative to sign on.
I am committed to this Select Committee. I want to make sure that it happens, right?
Really, Congress people all over the country are coming out in support of this because of how politically popular it is, and that is on the national agenda in a big way.
Hoyer said he appreciated the protesters' passion and that he was happy to hear from them, but he didn't address their demands. Sunrise noted that Hoyer has accepted $250,000 from fossil fuel executives, lobbyists, and PACs, and suggests that may influence his decisions. They want Democrats to reject such influence.
So the Select Committee would have every member that is part of it pledge to not take any money from fossil fuel executives. We need to make sure as the American people that this Select Committee that is meant to address climate change at the scale that is required, that we know that they're not in the back pockets of fossil fuel CEOs or being influenced in any way.
They had a similar message for West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who's a leading contender for the top Democrat on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee.
He has taken a lot of fossil fuel money. He literally shot a piece of climate legislation, famously.
Hours before the sit-ins, activists held 50 lobbying sessions with Democratic leaders. The New Deal was a series of public work projects, policies, and reforms enacted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. The unprecedented economic intervention helped pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Like its namesake, the New Deal, the Green New Deal will take massive investment. But the activists say that government funds need to be reallocated.
The IMF estimates that we spend $10 million a minute in subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And we've spent trillions in dollars on these industries, massive giveaways and subsidies. I would say that we have spent a lot more on billionaires and fighter jets than we have spent on actually improving our economy and our society so that it works for all people.
The protesters say the time to act is now.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, really powerful action. So we want to take some time right now to give everyone a chance to respond to what we watched. So there's going to be a few questions that we want to put up. We'll just go through each one. So again, remember the norms that we set, and feel free to put your answers in the chat if you don't feel comfortable coming off mute. So yeah, what were the goals of the sit-ins based on what we watched? You can feel free to unmute or just put in the chat. What was Sunrise trying to achieve by sitting in, doing a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office?
Getting them to commit to the Green New Deal or show some support for it.
Getting support for the Green New Deal.
I'll say actually, instead of just discussing it, going back and forth, actually taking action on it. As one of the people being interviewed actually stated that from time to time again, every person that went into office, they've only discussed it and said they were going to do these things, but it never went to the House floor. No bills were written to even vote on for it.
Yeah, that's a good nuance. Was someone else going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say to that end, the creation of a committee that was sort of Green New Deal focused and particularly focused on creating legislation was one way that they were hoping to get people to actually take action on that. Also, they were going to have people sign, what was it, like a pledge to say no more fossil fuel money in order to be on that committee.
Thanks, John.
I think there's also an important statement where I think a lot of Democrats sometimes feel safe under a blanket of being in the Democratic Party and being the party that's, because we're so bipartisan, is the more green party of the two. And I think that it's important for us, especially with the higher ranking members, to challenge that and to challenge where they actually stand rather than kind of hiding behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, kind of forcing them to be public with their opinion. Go ahead, Adrienne.
Yeah, for me, I noticed the focus on the Green New Deal, talking about jobs that will provide a living wage, like the New Deal, like the FDR New Deal, and hopefully that gets our representatives to realize that this is also for the working class, for the middle class, and that was an important message to get more people on board.
Yeah, that is also a really good point. So you all kind of started mentioning this. So who were the targets of the action? I think I heard representatives, people in office, but were there specific Congress people, specific targets? Just list them off.
The Rules Committee Chair, Jim McGovern.
Nancy Pelosi.
The new
from Maryland.
Yeah. Great. Those that weren't, and then also Talon put those that were not on board with the Green New Deal were also targets. So then among the people that we mentioned and other targets, what were some of the reactions that Sunrise received from the sit-in? So Shelby said there was a huge endorsement from AOC. John, I just noticed, I think, were you wanting to speak?
I certainly can give it a go. The one guy, I forget the congressman's name, but he pledged that he was in support of the deal, though was not on board with the pledge to, had taken fossil fuel donations in the past, and maybe was likely to again. So there was some additional follow-up action needed to see if he was actually going to follow through and take the pledge.
Nice. So based on some of these reactions that we got, would we say this was an effective action, and why or why not? And we'd love to hear from folks who haven't offered any, their thoughts yet.
I would say it was an effective action because not only did it get some members of Congress to support us, it also launched Sunrise into more of a national platform and national awareness. So I would say it was effective that way, even if it didn't accomplish the goal of getting Nancy Pelosi's support, which we still need, but it achieved other goals that weren't necessarily the main one, but it helped.
Thanks, Grace. Anyone else? We can take one more and then we can continue.
Yeah, I say I'm a member of the IBEW, the Electricians Union, and up until that time when Sunrise did the action, I don't think unions were paying attention to what it meant to them. And because it got such national news, union members started thinking, hey, there's something in it for us. And I saw a lot of the membership in my union start to pay attention and what it means for them, and that was important.
Yeah, bringing in labor. Actually, I just noticed, Justin, you put a comment that it didn't work. Would you be open to sharing in a few seconds what you mean by that?
Well, well, I don't know if if it's probably didn't work as well as we thought. If it's half of them the Democratic Party, it still seems too lazy to take it up.
Yeah, I hear that. We're going to touch on the importance of having multiple actions later on, so I think that's a really valid point. I think for the purpose of this action, what I understand is that the sit-in was very intentionally designed to be seen by the public, and the placement of banners and signs and the formation of participants, young protesters in handcuffs, and the constant energy that was sustained throughout these shared experiences, all these elements create optics that the media really wanted to share, and it helped spread Sunrise's demands. So we're going to move on to talk about what targets are and really define what we mean when we say targets. So I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, so given this definition of an action that Sophia described, one of the biggest parts of having an effective action is its ability to solicit a reaction from our target. So before we talk about what those reactions might look like, it might be helpful to do some additional defining. So what we call targets are the people who are the focus of your action. It's super important to note that targets are not institutions of any kind, but rather they are specific people within those institutions. So in the video of the Sunrise sit-in, the target was not necessarily the entire body of Congress, but rather specific members like Nancy Pelosi, Jim McGovern, Sidney Hoyer, etc. So generally we divide targets into two categories, primary targets and secondary targets. Primary targets are the individuals who have power over what you want. So for example, if what we want is to get something passed by a city's Board of Education, our primary targets would be those Board of Education members. And this means that when you're planning actions, you might want to consider the following questions. One, who has the power to give you what you want? And two, what power do you have over those people? And then secondary targets are the individuals who have power over our primary targets. So with those, you want to ask, who has the power over the people with the power to give you what you want? Who has the power to give you what you need to get what you want? And what power do you have over those people? So what direct action does is that they put public pressure onto primary targets through garnering negative press, galvanizing secondary targets. Indirect actions also help continue building people power because they bring more visibility to the groups that organize the action and thus can attract new supporters. So as is sort of illustrated on this slide, you don't just have like a single action that will bring us straight to our want. So that's why we think of a campaign as being a cascading wave of multiple actions that little by little get us closer to that want. So in Sunrise, we often target elected officials like Nancy Pelosi at the sit-in as Speaker of the House, or another example would be DC's Mayor Muriel Bowser, who's failed to take action on or make any meaningful commitments toward defunding the police. And so it's politicians like Pelosi and Bowser who are our primary targets because they have the power to legislate and institutionalize our wants. And with these examples, our secondary target, which is just as important, would be the public, because the public has control over our primary targets who are elected officials. So the Pelosi office sit-ins might have had potentially like a little bit of a direct impact on applying pressure directly to Pelosi by demonstrating the power that we as organizers hold. But for many other actions, and even in that sit-in, we actually didn't expect our primary targets to act based solely on the action itself, but rather we expected the action to create a reaction in the public, the secondary target, and we expected that public response to be what those elected officials respond to, because they still want to get elected and get votes and donations and all that. So this means the public's response to the action and the additional power that this builds is equally, if not more important than the primary target's immediate response to the action. So that's why, for example, it's so important to communicate with the press before and during events in a super intentional way, and also to spread our message to partners and to as many people as we can before the action, and to also just video record everything that we do at the action. Social media is a super powerful tool, and we can definitely use it to our advantage in this regard. So how do we figure out what types of actions will move our targets? The answer to that question comes down to self-interest. So self-interest, put simply, is what motivates anyone to act or not act. It's very important to come up with actions and campaigns that are designed around the self-interest of our targets. And that's why targets are always human beings and not organizations or institutions, because it's people themselves who have a specific self-interest. So for example, the DC Council as an institution does not necessarily have a self-interest per se, but each council member does. So wondering about you all, like, do you guys have any ideas of some ways we could figure out the self-interest of a target? Like how we can figure out what motivates someone in a target in particular? And feel free to just like throw some ideas in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and shoot some ideas on how we could figure that out. So votes, yeah. That would definitely be a self-interest of an elected official. Making elected officials worried about elections or embarrassment, definitely. That would be in their self-interest not to lose and not to be embarrassed. And just generally, like, how are some ways we could sort of research or determine someone's self-interest, whether it's an elected official or somebody else? So like, for instance, an example could be, let's see, someone said public donations to campaigns. Yeah, definitely elected officials want that. Regina said to see how they voted on legislation in the past. Yep, that's a really good one to figure out like what an elected official cares about. Articles and bios is what Nancy mentioned. For sure, especially for people who are like famous and you can't access them. You just read about them online. Pamela said find out who funds them. Simple Google search. Yeah, the internet is a great tool to figure that out. Researching actions, especially for local candidates, said Dylan. And Sam said, connect with organizers who can't do the spicy work to see what they really think. Yeah, those are all great ways to figure things out. Yeah, so basically you can read about them online. You can talk with people who already know about them. And you can also, oh, Dylan said talk to their staffers. Yeah, that's great. If you have access to their staffers, that's wonderful because they probably know a lot better than any like news article can tell you. John asked, would you ever meet with a staffer to figure out the elected official's interests? I mean, I don't know any elected official staffers, but I'm sure that's a perfectly legitimate way to figure out their self-interest. Yeah, and then another way is just you can make educated assumptions based off of their job, and you can kind of figure it out, or you can kind of theorize that way. So sometimes if you don't know the specifics of their self-interest, like you might not know your target's deep internal motivations, you can still theorize what might motivate them. More often than not, our targets are motivated by keeping their power, such as the position itself. They might just really enjoy that position, or the money that the position provides, whatever. Or they might be motivated by wanting to live out their personal values. Think of Congress members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar, whose actions are definitely motivated by the values of social and economic justice. So basically, putting it plainly, if someone is an elected official, keeping their job, getting good press, and just probably being seen as a well-liked public figure could all be a big part of their self-interest. And along those same lines, while we know that everyone is motivated by a self-interest, we cannot assume that our target has the same self-interest as us, or that they're motivated by the same goodwill as us, or that they'll do something just because it's the right thing to do. So another way to think about your target self-interest is to think about what your target needs. So you need to think about like what we need and what we want, but also what your target needs. And so elected officials, for instance, share a lot of needs in common. And you guys kind of already mentioned some things that elected officials need, right? You guys mentioned like donations and like votes. And other examples could be like more campaign volunteers or press attention. And an effective way to start out a campaign is basically with a series of actions that turn that primary target's needs into something that you have. So for example, your primary target, if they're an elected official who needs votes, your organization could try to organize their constituents around your issue, such as the Green New Deal. And so then your organization, in a sense, has what your primary target needs. And then the next step in your campaign could involve a series of actions that demonstrate to the elected official that they can't get their need, which is votes, until your organization gets your want, which is support of like Green New Deal legislation. So this would involve showing the politicians somehow that until they change their mind on this issue, they won't receive those votes from that block of constituents who you've organized. So with each action here, not only are you turning your primary target's needs into something that you have, but you're at the same time turning something that you need into something you have. And basically, if you need, say, for instance, you need people power in order to get your want, like the Green New Deal, you're doing that by organizing the primary target's constituents. And each time you do that, each time you turn what you need into what you have the ability to get the next thing that you need. So next, sorry about all that jumble, but next Sophia will walk through some historical examples that hopefully kind of make it more concrete.
That was great, Anna. So putting it in context in recent history, Some of you may know what this photo is from. It is an example of an effective action that was put on by members of ACT UP, which is a grassroots political movement that was active during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And they were protesting the government for being indifferent towards people with AIDS. And the government dragged their feet for years, and so ACT UP decided to escalate because they needed to add pressure to make the government move faster. So what they did was they took the cremated human remains of their loved ones who had died of AIDS, and on October 13th, 1996, they scattered those ashes onto the White House lawn. And this was really powerful because they took that pain that so many people were feeling privately, the death of their loved ones from this scary disease. At the time, they didn't know a lot about it. And they brought it into the public eye for people to see and to empathize with. And it was a bold action that called out the inaction of the government to address the crisis. So with this action, who are the two sides? Like, what would you say were the two sides that they were trying to cast as opposed to each other? So we have AIDS victims on one side and the government on one side, right? So if you were there at the time, after seeing this action or hearing about it, which side would you be on? And maybe a couple people can share which side and why. That's true, it's a really heavy action. Katie said ACT UP really led with incredible movement building. They're really great films and articles on their work. And Nancy put that, yeah, use and rising organizers, and that I learned during my fellowship. This is a really important concept, and basically it's how do we differentiate between an action and what we call an activity. So we're going to go through a few slides to distinguish between these two things, using Sunrise as an example. But basically, actions lead us to the next step in our campaign, whereas activities are just simply things that we do. So actions versus activities. One distinction is that in an action, we ask who, or we try to talk to the right people. So this would be personally visiting a staffer or a specific member of Congress. Whereas an activity is just, we're thinking about the what, like how many people we want to turn out. And this would simply be like picketing outside of the Capitol. Another distinction is that an action is a means to an end. So using the Sunrise as an example, making the Green New Deal something that people would talk about, that's a means towards an end. Whereas activity is an end within itself. So maybe just sending an email to your listserv, I mean, it's a worthwhile activity, but it's it kind of just stops there, right? Another distinction is that an action is just the beginning. There's a follow-up. So like you might galvanize people and elected officials around the Green New Deal, get them excited about next steps. Whereas an activity would be, a march where you go for a couple hours. It's there's maybe like a huge crowd outside congressional buildings, but when it's over, there's not really a lot of follow-up, and you just kind of go home, and it just kind of ends there. Also, when we evaluate an action, right, we talked about earlier, we look for a reaction. So this could be like literally a clear reaction, such as from Congressman McGovern, like clearly saying like, I support this, right? That's like the best kind of, one of like the most tangible kinds of reactions. Whereas in evaluating an activity, we might just look at logistics, like how many people showed up, how many people did we get to sign a petition? And I feel like, especially in the nonprofit world, I feel like this is where we get caught up a lot in, right? Like the vanity metrics. So that's a really clear, important distinction. In actions, we want to get something new. So we want maybe to grow new leaders, interest, energy, think about possibilities and new ways of thinking about an issue. So like getting press attention, popularizing the Green New Deal, like from, not really being known a couple years ago to like now it's like on the agenda of like Congress people and everyone's talking about the Green New Deal. That was, example of a reaction. Whereas an activity, we might end up getting really tired and burned out. And so it's like asking people over and over again outside the Capitol, like getting people to like sign on to a better climate policy. It could, when we don't see the reaction, it might lead us to feel really tired. And finally, an important distinction is with actions, we are actively working towards fixing things that are broken. So directly interfacing with members of Congress to talk about the Green New Deal. That's an example of an action, whereas an activity, at best we're just learning about what's broken. And this could be like maybe attending a training on the history of the climate justice movement. Again, it's valuable, but I think that the distinction between an action activity is that one is like making concrete steps towards fixing the issue. So I'll turn over to Anna now to talk about some other tactics.
Thanks, Sophia. So at the Sunrise Movement, we believe 3 main tactics are crucial for making an action effective, and those are disruption, sorry, I don't know if you heard that. Those 3 are disruption, sacrifice, and participation. So disruption gets in the way of how things are currently operating. An example of disruption is Sunrise activists protesting at elected officials' houses at 6 a.m. to wake them up and their neighbors up. So disruption is a way to demand attention for your cause. And an action that doesn't disrupt the day-to-day of power is an action that will probably be ignored. So if you're disrupting the day-to-day activities of your targets, you're more likely to bring their attention to those activities. And if you choose to do blockades or other actions that might be highly disruptive to the public, it becomes extra important to highlight the fact that sacrifices are being made by those activists and organizers. And I'll talk a little bit more about sacrifice as a tactic, but basically it helps the public understand why we're doing what we're doing and can make them a little bit more sympathetic to our cause. So for example, the Pelosi sit-ins received so much media attention in part because of how disruptive they were to the day-to-day schedules, not only of Pelosi and her staffers, but also to the surrounding area as well. People couldn't get to their offices without walking through crowds of noisy protesters. And similarly, our Wide Awake actions, where Sunrise members have been visiting the houses of elected officials early in the morning to wake them up, those have also been highly disruptive and have even drawn a little bit of negative attention. But we wouldn't choose to do these highly disruptive actions if we thought it was possible to achieve change in easier ways, or if this was a minor issue. We choose the disruptive actions because to resist this pain and to feel it in their own hearts and to be moved to taking action with us on our issue. All that said, something important I want to take a minute to emphasize is that sacrifice is not something that we ought to glorify. For example, sometimes sacrifice that's made in moral protest is arrest. We want to be very clear that arrest is not something to ever be celebrated, and that celebrating arrest is police compliance. Also, people who are white or in cis, for instance, getting arrested is nowhere near the sacrifice it is for Black folks, Indigenous folks, other people of color, members of the trans community, undocumented folks, other groups. So this idea of what actually counts as sacrifice is super different for white people versus BIPOC, or versus people versus trans people, or documented versus undocumented. And that statement goes beyond just arrests. It applies to other sacrifices as well. And that's something that organizers need to be very aware of as we escalate. And lastly, having widespread participation shows power and popularity. So for example, the Memphis strike that was mentioned earlier only worked because a lot of sanitation workers went out on strike collectively. Similarly, the Pelosi sit-ins had hundreds of young people from around the country. If there had been just a couple people who showed up, the disruption would have been smaller. The protesters would have been a lot easier to arrest and clear out quickly before anyone could take notice. And so it would have drawn in much less media coverage and overall been a less powerful action. But in reality, there was a lot of participation, so it was disruptive. It did get coverage, and it was incredibly powerful. So in Sunrise, we often think of effective actions as those that bring the truth of a crisis to the public. In other words, direct actions bring people together around collective wants. And as we saw in the previous examples, these actions ask the public which side they're on. And this brings us to our spectrum of support, which is our tool for building and measuring people power. So on the left, you'll see the Sunrise Movement, which is us. And on the right, you'll see the opposition. And then you'll see every level of support in between. So imagine that if you were a conservative, even someone like Mitch McConnell, a Sunrise action probably wouldn't bring you all the way to our side. But that's why people on the far right aren't actually who we're targeting at actions like the Pelosi sit-ins. Who are we targeting with our moral protest? That would be largely passive supporters and neutrals. So our goal is to bring them off the sidelines and into the fight. So that's where and how we want to polarize around our demands. So a question I have for the folks in the audience, what do you guys think the role of the opposition should be, like the people on the far right? Do you think we should engage with them, or like should we ignore them? What do you guys think? If our goal is to, like, bring them, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I feel like that's definitely a difficult thing that I feel like I try to think about when I'm like interacting with even day-to-day people, because there's some people that are very enthusiastic about, you know, their support for Trump and that kind of thing. And I feel like it's like a very delicate balance between protecting your energy and like your mental health and just like literally the amount of effort you want to put into like trying to change somebody's mind who doesn't even necessarily value you as a person. I think I agree with the tactic that is currently being used, in which like kind of targeting passive people, because I think that if someone is a brick wall, there's no amount of words that you could say to convince them of otherwise. And I think you can't teach people compassion, especially like grown men. So yeah.
I think that's a great point. And I would agree with that we all have limited energy, especially a lot of organizing work that people do. It's not paid. So it's like you only have so much time. And yeah, like you said, some people can be more like a brick wall. Justin said, maybe try a contrarian argument with them. Justin, would you mind potentially getting off of mute to like elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that?
Well, I don't know. It's just like I'm gonna try like showing whatever argument they have against what you're arguing for. It's just like try taking that argument and showing them how it's like how like if they really did believe in that, then they would support it. Like for example, like with like let's just like say like something that I just like care about, like the Electoral College. It's like if you say something about like silencing small communities, well then just like point out that there are small communities in New York and Oregon who are like conservative, but like you never have never heard of them because the Electoral College doesn't care about them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. There's definitely a lot of contradictions in certain things that people in the opposition are fighting for. And so I think it's valid to point that out. We've been seeing that kind of recently with the Supreme Court opening up, and like a lot of people on the left have been talking about how a lot of Republicans back in 2016 had made contradictory statements about when is the right time to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. So I think that's super valid.
Can I ask a question about the wide awake actions? So like thinking through this spectrum of support and kind of the self-interest. I'm just wondering why like Lindsey Graham and like Mitch McConnell are the targets rather than like Cory Gardner and trying to think who else like might be like somebody up for re-election. You know what I mean?
I'm wondering if there's a Sunrise person here who could be better at answering that than I could, because I was not part of but I can try to speculate if.
I can try to answer that. Part of the reason that we target those that we know aren't going to agree with us and that we know we're not going to be able to necessarily push at all, definitely not to our side, is that they're not our only target. So we talked earlier about like primary versus secondary targets. We're also targeting the public. We're trying to, make a statement and push our messaging through in a way that attracts press and also illuminates like the ways in which these politicians that we are targeting, they aren't the ones necessarily that are going to change their minds, but people that vote for them might change their minds. And the public that might be ambivalent towards their policies might understand better of why we're doing what we're doing and why that these politicians are a target in the first place. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Katie also mentioned that the numbers of passive folks far outweigh the conservatives. So there's strength in numbers, and that's like also gives it kind of like better bang for your buck in terms of time. Awesome. So yeah, those are all really great points. But I guess the key here is that with our actions, our goal usually isn't going to be trying to move the opposition. And in fact, we actually expect through strategic moral protest that the number of people on the spectrum who fall into the opposition might actually grow, because we're forcing people to take a side, getting rid of the neutrals in between and pulling people into active participation in our movement. And then people who decide not to do that end up in the opposition. And so kind of like to sum it up, we take action to activate passive supporters and to bring people into the movement. And going back to the Pelosi sit-ins, I just want to talk a little bit about the outcomes. So our goal was never to get Pelosi to adopt the Green New Deal, because that wasn't super realistic at the time. Our goal was just to get the public on our side and to make them feel like Pelosi should do it. Does anybody in the room want to come off mute and read some of these headlines by any chance? Anyone can do it if they want.
I'll read one. Ocasio-Cortez, youth protesters storm Pelosi office to push for climate plan. Keep going.
Thank you. Is there somebody else who was going to go? Wants to read a different headline?
Activists again demand Green New Deal, stage demonstration at Dem leaders' offices.
Nice, thank you. There's also Pelosi offers meeting to Green New Deal activists as 61 protesters are arrested at her office. And Green New Deal, Ocasio-Cortez unveils bold plan to fight climate change. So as we can see from these headlines, with enough pressure, your politicians eventually have to listen. Those unlikely to follow through without pressure, like Pelosi, will definitely want to save face. And then those who are already on our side, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, will feel supported enough to take bold action and introduce a bill or a resolution, which is exactly what she ended up doing. So either way, no one can ignore the pressure of such a large audience. And it's important to note that one sit-in alone wasn't enough. We had 3 sit-ins before anyone, the media, the public, elected officials, listened to us at all. And so one action won't be enough, and one action is not the end goal. You take action, you pick up more interested new folks, you grow bigger, and then you take an even bigger action again and again. So after all that, what does success look like? Well, once Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Green New Deal into Congress, the pressure was on for everybody. So we kept taking action more and more, bigger and bigger, to get as many Congress people to support it as possible. So this list of co-sponsors is all because of those repeated, continued, and sustained actions. So the fight to pass the Green New Deal is an ongoing struggle, but you can see how strong, growing, repeated, sustained, polarizing action laid the groundwork for all of the progress that you see here. And so this brings us to the train, act, recruit cycle. So you can't take action just once or keep taking actions of the same exact size. It's super important that we continuously recruit new people at actions and train them to be leaders, and then have them organize an action and repeat that cycle to grow it. And then I'll pass it along to Sophia.
Thanks, Anna. That was really good information. We just have one last thing that we wanted folks to ponder, but before that, can we all just take a collective breath in and out? Just, well, again, just to absorb all the things that we have shared. So another deep breath together and out. Yes. So in thinking about everything that we have talked about for the last hour or so, and going back to the action that you identified at the beginning of this section, what do you think could have been different to make that action more effective? We're going to take maybe 3 minutes for folks to pop in the chat, or maybe a couple folks can come off mute if you like to verbally process. So what could have been different to make the action more effective? So Nancy put, I would have loved if someone from the org had reached out to me for one-to-one, really wanted to join, but was never able to speak with someone directly. Yeah, I think that is a common thing that I also have experienced. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, comments from Regina, I just think I've attended a lot of activities and not actions. Yes, I can relate. I wish I knew who the target was. Yeah, would have been great to have a street team ready to mingle and get folks talking to each other at the event, not just listening at the rally. There wasn't a large press presence at my last action, which detracted from its impact overall. And then, in addition to maybe not knowing who the target was, it's helpful to know why the person was a target, and overall maybe that action could have been more targeted. Yeah, I think these are all really good reflections, and there's always room for growth and improvement. And I think, yeah, I just really appreciate all the reflections you offered. So as you think about planning actions, moving forward, especially in these next couple of months, yeah, just feel free to take these things with you. Okay, I'm sorry to say I missed what you said about Lindsey Graham, a greater emphasis on the impact of his actions for a public narrative instead of the personal aspect of him being a hypocrite. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so this is where we're going to end for today. We have a little bit of closing, but just personally, thank you all so much for engaging. I know for some of us, it's been a long work day, so I really appreciate all of your collective wisdom. So in terms of what comes next, there's going to be a part 3, electoral organizing, next Tuesday, same time, same place. I think you should be getting a text or something in your email with the link, but definitely hope that folks can make it to the next training on Tuesday, next Tuesday. Yes, and bring a friend. The more the merrier. I'm wondering if any of the other organizers have any announcements. Otherwise, I can close this out. Naeem dropped a link for the next event. Oh, you know what? We do have some time. So we have about like 10 minutes. I think if folks feel like they need to tap out, feel free to, and definitely feel free to connect with us for one-to-ones, and we can talk about where you want to plug in. You can email. Nancy put her email in the chat. Yeah, so if folks want to like head out, I think it's okay. But if others want to just stay on for like a couple more minutes to chat, I'm going to be here. And I think some of us will be here too. So.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophia and Anna. Thanks for everyone who did tech. Thank you all for participating. Hope you got a lot out of this. And yeah, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will see you next Tuesday.